YOLO composing gloves here, and today we're going to be talking about the separate sub. So there are two big ideas about how separate subs work. One is it is a layer in your track, such as this right here. So you can see here, this is just outlining my chord progression. It's just a layer. It's there to reinforce my sub. The other is similar to the kick examples we did. A sound might be really interesting, but it's taking up areas of the spectrum that we don't particularly appreciate. And so we will lop off part of the spectrum and insert a separate sub. And that way the low end of our spectrum is preserved. That way when we play it over big speaker systems, we don't get all that extra mud, because all that stuff's going to become much more obvious over a large system. And so you just get that clean sine wave. It's really clear what's going on in the bass, and your high end is not compromised. So those are the two sort of modes of thought. One is to lop off stuff. The other one's to have it as a layer. And there is this third one, which we will talk about, but it's not really in sound design. It's more of a songwriting thing. It's the sub bass is the sub. Like, that's what it is. That's your bass. So these are like deep bass tracks where you just have this really smooth low sub. And if you generally listen to these things on big systems that support sub really well. And so you get this really sweet, like, the bass literally moves you because it's so huge. So I'll show you some stuff like that as well, or at least link you to some. So first off, I have an example here. You heard that as a supporting role, but let's go ahead and put it in context. So this is my track Blend. It's on my YouTube channel, but you can see over here, I'll play it from right here to a little ways into this, and you'll hear the sub come in many ways. That will, like over here, there's like some sub in some of these samples that give you like little hints. And then here, there's this enormous sub drop. Listen for it. It goes, boom, you know, like one of those things, like a dive bomb. And then, sorry, something in my chest. And then we've got the layered in sub right here, which is the typical layered sub bass. And in this case, it's not because one of my sounds is too muddy. It's because I need to have some definition in the low end. There's not enough low end. Most of my sound design's in the high end in this track. So without further ado, here you go. So you get the idea. So we're going right there. It's doing its job. You clearly hear the sub bass going boom, 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 and it just drives home the point of the progression. We move forward. There's even a cool little slide thing at the transition here that I think really helps. Check it out. Right there, similar to the one we had. That's the big sub drop I was talking about earlier. If we play this, I used to use these a lot more. Now this isn't the cleanest one, but it's one, I really like it because it's got like this ear sound. And to me, that was cool. So, I mean, whatever floats your boat, you can go for a really clean sine wave. The reason that sounds the way it does is because it's actually got upper harmonics moving with it. And so, yes. Now, this is something that has flux we are moving down. We'll actually talk about this more later when we address the sine wave. So anyways, there's a clear example of a separate sub just doing its typical job. And things like dubstep, where bass sounds are very interesting, it's common to lop off part of it and put in this sub to maintain the clarity of the low end. And you can see the low end, everything's really defined. There's not like, nothing else is really messing with anything else. You have no problem discerning the lead. It sounds good over multiple systems. If I were to put this over a really big system, it would sound even better because of the mix that I've set up. It's been made to go big, you know what I'm saying? So that when you do it, you can feel like that bass just pounding you, but you're thinking about the melody. No one like is listening for the bass unless you're like a sound engineer. Like I'm the guy who's like, oh, I don't know about that sub bass. But everyone else, all they hear is the melody and the kick and they're just going for it, right? So That's like the difference in listening styles. But if we come over here to my little book, which is again in the description for free, I have a couple things I'd like to bring up as well. So the first thing is I include in my lessons a consider what others has to say section, which I plan to expand as is necessary. I think I skipped it, and it is right here. Consider what others have to say. So this one's for our sub bass section, right? So deadmau5 and Steve Duda both talk about this, and they take a mastering perspective, which is really good for the end. A lot of people mess up their bass at the beginning. We've already talked about this a little bit, and it's not a sound design topic, but it's something you definitely want to consider. And while you're working, things like this are things that influence some of the decisions I make early on. Slink also has something. He talks about adding harmonics to your sub bass so that it comes across on multiple systems. That's a very common thing talked about. And I like the way Slink presents it, so you can check it out. I have a little paragraph somewhere in this. It's near the end of the sub bass chapter where I say, watch out for dogmatic tutorials. I've seen people just give straight out wrong advice about certain topics, especially concerning limiters, but also about sub bass and the way you should treat your subs. I've just seen really crazy things said. It's a common thing that if someone says something about the sub on Reddit, usually a bunch of people will jump on that guy for saying something weird. But on YouTube tutorials, I've noticed that doesn't really happen as much. Usually it's a bunch of people who are brand new going, oh, thanks for the advice. And then you think it's good advice and it ends up being really bad. So here are some tutorials I consider safe tutorials that you will not be steered in a weird direction. Seamless R has a great example of one where he's got a sound that's got some mud in the low end. And he talks about, I'm going to remove some of this and put a sub in, and then it'll sound cleaner overall. And just so you know, if you were to picture this, if we have mud at the beginning and then we run that through several compressors and then we master that, our low end's just going to be this incredibly large mess. Where if you remove it, put a sine wave there, and then just turn your sine wave down, your sine wave will be turned up later in the mix, and then it will sound great. So in my mixing phase, I take all this stuff into consideration. When I'm creative, I consider a lot less of it. I'll probably do things to add separate subs because to me, that's also partially a creative thing to do. The processes blend a little bit. And so Seamless has a really good one on it, I think. And then I still need to link some of these, but there's a couple others that you can check out as well. And so down here, if we come down to the sub bass section, I'd also like to point out, so I pretty much just say, watch out for this sort of stuff. And I also reference the harmonic spectrum a little bit. If you're going to add a sub, consider your spectrums and what's going on. Is the sub going to help, or is it going to imply a fundamental that's going to mess with the inversion of your chord, which is something we talked about in the music theory video earlier. So be careful about that sort of things. These are problems that come with the separate sub. A lot of tracks I make these days, actually, I don't use a ton of separate sub. If it's necessary, I will. But I don't. If you listen to my track, Chug Chug, it's a glitch hop track. It's a really recent one. I'm really actually very happy with the way the mix came out. There is no separate sub. Instead, I chose to use post-processing techniques along with layered distortions and things of that nature and control tone in a different way. A lot of tracks don't need a separate sub. They're just not necessary. So be careful. Don't add one because you think it's a piece you're missing. Add it because you hear that it's missing. It's not something you think. Your ear will guide you to it. Now, if you're at the beginning, by all means, just add it to everything and get a feel for when you like it there and when you don't like it there. But don't be afraid to remove it. I feel like a lot of people just sort of put it there because it's expected. So I've even seen criticisms by people who I will not mention who actually criticize other people for not putting things there. And it's bro, it sounds fine without it. He's just saying that because he thinks it needs to be in every single track. I think that's really a narrow musical view. So be careful. Also, playing. So, okay. If you choose to use a filtered method, so there's a couple ways we could generate our sub bass. This one uses a filter method. As you can see, I'm using a filter here to generate my sub. And that's why there's upper harmonics in this patch. If I chose to just use a pure sine wave, which I could do by controlling the harmonics, or in Synth1, I could just turn the sub oscillator on. Actually, in Synth1, you would just leave the sub oscillator off and just use the sine wave on oscillator 1. And you would get the same exact result, right? Just a pure frequency, just play it low. So you want to be careful because if you choose to use something with more harmonics, which is something that Slink advocates because of the style of music he makes, And usually this advice is genre specific. So again, be careful for that. But if you do choose to use something with higher harmonics so it comes across on maybe smaller systems a little bit better, things like a phone that don't support sub bass, then you want to be careful about how you're influencing your harmonic spectrum. Generally follow the overtone series. Safest bet, usually octaves are the most safe. If you're going to add another one, the fifth above. If you're going to add more frequencies to that, just be a bit careful. And there's also things about, if you're going to throw it through a distortion chain, that's nonlinear, and that'll actually introduce harmonics in, I think, a more organic way, but that's like something we'll talk about another day. You'll see, as you can see, distortion is quite the interesting topic. I tend to mention it as a precaution. I always preface it with, remember, this thing's not linear. So if you do different volume levels, you're going to get different results. It's going to be really crazy. And in Chug Chug, that's actually a fundamental part of how I got the bass to sound the way that it does. So, all right. In dubstep, so in advanced sound design, the sub's often included as a sound, as part of the sound. When you're mixing, it's usually looked at as you're going to add this thing as a separate layer. But if you look at like some of Seamless R's videos, he'll integrate the sub in a really subtle way. And in drum and bass, which is the genre he makes, it's that's typically the way you do things. It's either blatantly obvious that there's a separate sub, or they'll integrate it in this way that's really pretty subtle. You still get the feeling of the sub, but it's pretty hard to hear like a blatant separate tone that is clearly a sub going on. So, okay. Classic, right? So, okay, here we have our sound. And what they'll do is they'll have like some crazy bass sound. I don't know. We'll just really quick play a low tone. And then they'll throw in this. So if I were to turn this off and go to operator 4 and output operator 4, they'll toss in sub bass, which in Citrus you would generally do. That's like too low though. Let's go to 0.5 because we're already playing low notes. That's another thing. Range is really specific, important. If you're using a filtered sub bass, you don't want to go past the frequency cutoff, otherwise your bass will disappear. For example, if I played, there's a note, if I play a really high note, as you can see, I'm playing the high note. Look at this. But there's nothing there because I'm going past the filter cutoff. So that should be pretty obvious though. So here, he'll put them in, except for at really low amplitudes. And it will go through some of the same post-processing, but it won't go through any of the FM synthesis. And that will create a really dynamic, integrated sub-tone. So, yeah, I mean, you can get really fancy with some of these things. And with Citrus, you have some pretty extensive routing options. And so that allows you to do some pretty streamlined things. So there's more advanced techniques. You'll see them. We'll largely implement them as we do the sound design. So don't worry about that as a separate thing. But that is a thing you would do with sub bass in some genres that you wouldn't do in others. And again, not every genre requires a sub bass. Drum and bass. Oh yeah, and then there's also, so I have to mention this, there's this whole body of music. There's actually multiple genres that have it, but anything that says deep in the genre usually has this. It's basically the sub bass is the sound unto itself. And I've linked to a track in a mix that has this, and the person who made this mix called it jazzy deep bass, deep house. It's like, it's in that area. I really like this particular genre, but I'm not really sure what to call it. I know it's some mix of like, obviously some jazz influence, maybe a little bit of bossa nova here or there, like a subtle hint, not like a huge amount. And then a lot of deep house, and you wind up with this like thing. And it's really cool. You've totally heard music probably of this style before. So go check it out. It's very relaxing. If you're just like driving at night, it's just like, it creates a certain aesthetic. So check that out. That's why like the sub bass is the bass sound. And we're going to do an example exercise where we'll actually do something similar to the things done in this track. And then I also list Zomboy here because he's excellent. Like most of his mixes are great examples of ways of using the separate sub. And don't be afraid for your separate sub. You saw my examples had these big long notes that fit for what it was doing. But if you're doing a rhythmic drop, obviously your bass is not going to be these big tones that would ruin your song. Virtual Riot has a lot of great examples of this as well. So you want to, break it up, make it match the rhythm of your song. And another thing with sub bass, you couldn't see it because I was up here, but you see down here, I have this going on. This is just a volume control. So whenever the kick hits, the bass is off and then it comes in. That way my kick comes through very cleanly. And I choose this method sometimes because it allows me to get more specific and exact results as opposed to using like a compressor or something like that. This is just really easy and specific in my opinion. It's even better than some tools that do this basically for you because I can come in, make one unique, make a change at one spot, and all the others will stay the same. So I really like this for the exactness I can get out of it. So there's another thing. So don't be afraid to remove the sub, make it match your rhythm. There's plenty of examples that I link here. And then watch out for people who are just saying things because they were told that too. And don't feel pressured to add a sub bass to every single track you do. You know, a lot of tracks don't need them. You're not going to hear sub basses in chiptune tracks unless it's a really weird chiptune track. It's not something you do. If you're making big EDM, it's something that happens an awful lot, but it's not in every single track. Some tracks just don't have it. So there you have it. There's my spiel on the separate sub. There's a ton of videos about it. Check them out. Subscribe, support me on Patreon. If you have something you'd like to add it in the comments and let other people know. And have a blessed day.